Dr. Kenneth and Quinn served as ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia from 1996 to 1999 and retired after 30 years in the Foreign Service as one of the most decorated diplomats of his generation. One of the U.S. government's foremost experts in Indochina, he is widely acknowledged to be the first person to report in 1974 on the genocidal policies of the Khmer Rouge. 20 years later, while serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, his plan for agricultural enhancements of rural roads led to the final eradication of the Khmer Rouge. A fluent speaker in Vietnamese, Dr. Quinn acted as interpreter for President Gerald Ford at the White House and personally negotiated the first ever entry by U.S. personnel into a Vietnamese prison to search for American prisoners of war. Ambassador Quinn assumed leadership of the World Food Prize in January of 2000. Inspired by the vision of Dr. Norman Borlaug, the founder of the World Food Prize, he has endeavored to build this annual award into the Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. Last May, Dr. Quinn was presented with the prestigious Iowa Award by Governor Terry Branstad. The Iowa Award represents the state's highest citizen award and is presented only once every few years. Past recipients of the Iowa Award have included uncommon Iowans like Dr. Norman Borlaug, Dr. George Washington Carver, and President Herbert Hoover. Ambassador, thank you for joining us today as we honor the nation's 31st president.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that very nice introduction. One of the things when I received the Iowa Award I thought about was that President Hoover was the very first recipient of it in 1951, and to in any way even be slightly associated with someone of his great accomplishments. You know, I called the governor's office and said, I think there's been some mistake. This probably was meant to be a letter, you know, saying I owed more taxes, but I'm not going to give it back. It was a wonderful rendition of two songs that still, even though I've heard them so many times in my life, still, you know, raise a few goosebumps. But they're particularly poignant today to hear the Star-Spangled Banner, because after all, it was Herbert Hoover, as president, who was the one who approved and confirmed the Star-Spangled Banner as our national anthem. And to hear the battle hymn of the Republic. It had to be for Herbert Hoover, who at his core and his essence was about freedom. To know that here near West Branch, there were stations of the Underground Railroad in which people who were living in slavery were endeavored to get their freedom. So, Andrew Hoover and Teenie, you know, I just learned that you're the namesake for the very first Hoover, for Andreas Hoover, who came to the United States from Switzerland, changed his name to Andrew Hoover, and that. So it's wonderful to be here with you, with Alexander, Leslie, all of the Hoover family. I'm so sorry that Margaret couldn't be here today, and because it was she who conveyed to me this invitation, and I was so anxious to see her. And I know I spoke to her on the phone, and she told me how heartbroken she is that she can't be here today. Senator Robert Dvorsky and Senator David Johnson are here, both great friends of the World Food Prize. And yeah, Senator Johnson's dad, Donald Johnson, was one of the first people to tell me about the Hoover legacy. And Senator Dvorsky's daughter has been working for me as an intern for the last 6 months, so I feel a special connection to both of them. And congratulations also to the Hoover Hunger Fighting Project this morning that I think packaged 84,000 meals to feed hungry people abroad and at home. I'm sure he's happy. He's happy about that and honoring his legacy. And Stephen Lauer from my World Food Prize team is here, and he's going to be writing a story for our Iowa Hunger Directory about that accomplishment. So Dr. Schwartz and Peter Swisher, Charlie Becker, Jerry Flegel, all of you who are here. I also want to be sure I recognize the winners of the Hoover Uncommon Leadership Award, who you honored this week, Senator Nancy Betker and Representative Steve Olson on that, and also the Uncommon Students. You know, when Governor Bob Ray was chairing that, I was a judge down here for that, and so I know that program, and they were indeed Uncommon Students. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, that heart, which had been filled with such energy and empathy for 90 years, finally succumbed to the toxins that were assaulting his body. And so death came for the great humanitarian on a Tuesday morning in Suite 31A of the Waldorf Towers in New York City. There, his personal physician, Dr. Michael Lepore, read from a sheet of Waldorf Astoria paper to 2 wire service reporters, and in which in handwritten script it simply stated, President Hoover, October 20, 1964, 11:35 a.m. His 2 sons, Herbert Jr. and Alan Henry, had been present when their father, the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Clark Hoover, had expired. And later that day, Neil McNeil, an old friend of Hoover's, called a press conference on the 4th floor of that same hotel, at which he announced what would be the headline of Hoover's life. Quote, "A great American has ended a brilliant career of service to his fellow men. Above all, he was a humanitarian. He fed more people and saved more lives than any other man in history." End quote. Thus ended a great personal odyssey that had begun in this small Iowa town of West Branch on August 10, 1874, and which had taken Herbert Hoover to Stanford, Australia, the Boxer Rebellion in China, London, 2 world wars in Europe, the cabinet, the White House, and travel around the globe, assessing hunger and delivering succor to starving people. And at the same time, it began the historic state funeral of President Hoover, which would traverse the 2 cities that had inflicted upon him the greatest political pain of his life. New York, the location of the stock market crash of 1929, and Washington, where his embattled presidency had ended in his defeat for re-election in 1932. And that state funeral would culminate here in the Iowa countryside, as you heard General Orr describe, at this same exact hour of 3 p.m. 50 years ago on Sunday, October 25th, 1964. If in his life his legacy had been used as a divisive cudgel in partisan electoral battles, in death, Herbert Hoover provided a unifying moment for a country which, it need be recalled, was just 2 weeks away from the bitterly contested 1964 presidential election. President Lyndon Johnson and Vice President Hubert Humphrey attended the memorial service at St. Bartholomew's Church, just across from the Waldorf, as did Senator Barry Goldwater and his running mate for President, William Miller. And Richard Nixon, the former Vice President, and Senator Robert F. Kennedy were there as well. And at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, the President's remains were placed on the same catafalque that had held Abraham Lincoln's body almost 100 years earlier, and John F. Kennedy's body just 11 months previous. On Sunday morning, the 25th, his casket was flown to Iowa. And on a magnificent autumn day, with temperature in the mid-70s, like today, in the countryside, this blend of gold, brown, and orange foliage, Iowans lined the streets, parked along the shoulders of the interstate, and filled the overpasses just to have a glimpse of the motorcade as it traveled from the Cedar Rapids Airport here to West Branch. From 75 to 80,000 persons were estimated to have gathered here on these grounds and in nearby cornfields that had been hurriedly harvested and mowed down just the day before. All total, as many as 100,000 people either stood along the procession route or were present here to honor the first president born west of the Mississippi. More than double the number of people who had filed past his casket in New York and Washington combined. Hoover friend and Quaker elder Dr. Eldon Trueblood spoke, pronounced the benediction, the presidential wreath was laid, the bugler sounded taps, the flag covering the casket folded and presented to Herbert Hoover Jr., and at 3:35 p.m., the burial service was concluded and the family withdrew. The public was then allowed to file past the grave, and their numbers were so great that even as that glowing autumnal sun was setting to the west and the glorious red reflection filled the sky, the long winding line of mourners were still moving past this burial site, paying a final tribute to that son of Iowa who at long last had returned home. Now, Herbert Hoover's burial here reflects the confluence of the journey of two pioneer families. On his mother Huldah Minthorn's side, with Quakers who arrived in New England in 1630 and had made a home in Canada before migrating south to Iowa. And Huldah attended Iowa State University. And by his father, ancestor, Andrew Hoover, who arrived in America in 1738 and eventually settled in North Carolina along the Uwharrie River, where Herbert Hoover's great-grandfather, Jesse, was born in 1799. And 2 years later, Jesse's family began a trek through the wilderness of Kentucky to eventually settle near Stillwater, Ohio. And then, in 1853, burning with what was called Iowa fever, that had been ignited by John Deere's steel plow that suddenly made the prairie farmable, Jesse Hoover loaded his family onto a schooner wagon, crossed the Mississippi, and followed the rutted wagon tracks that are now Interstate 80. And his son Eli, Herbert Hoover's grandfather, is recorded as filing a claim for a plot of land here in Cedar County just 7 years after Iowa achieved statehood. And as pioneers crossed the Appalachian Mountains and streamed into the expansive Western Reserve and the Louisiana Purchase, they were suddenly free of all bonds and shackles of governments, which had bound all previous generations in Europe and on the East Coast of America. Now they would rely only on themselves and the groups of which they were a part, such as a religious domination like the Quakers. And it was these experiences and this tradition of self-reliance that became part of the Hoover family DNA, and from which Herbert Hoover's political philosophy was derived, in which he outlined in his 1922 publication, American Individualism. And it was this concept of individualism that he would embrace until his death, and which is being carried forward with great passion and enthusiasm by his great-granddaughter, Margaret Hoover. Now, Hoover's last public appearance came on May 22, 1963, at a luncheon at the Waldorf to honor astronaut L. Gordon Cooper, whom the former president likened to other trailblazers like Lewis and Clark, Lindbergh, Admiral Byrd, whose individualism, he contended, had produced such incredible achievements. You know, hearing that story made me think about the amazing technological transformation that occurred during Hoover's lifetime. So when he was born here in West Branch, no one here might have imagined such things as electricity, telephone, motorized farm machinery, and yet he lived to be the first president to ever have a telephone on his desk, to be the first to appear on television. And I wonder, is that where Margaret gets her TV genes? I see her. And to watch football and baseball games that he loved on color TV, and to honor astronauts who circled the planet, all in his lifetime. Hoover's passing began a process of reconsidering his role as president during the Great Depression and giving emphasis instead to his array of humanitarian accomplishments, for which he was 5 times nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and which he should have won at least once. He was praised not only for addressing hunger following both world wars, as we heard the consul say, but also in so effectively coordinating relief efforts for more than 600,000 people following the flooding of New Orleans in 1927, and leading commissions about the reorganization of the government. He was even recognized for his well-known love of fishing. One admirer said, quote, "Even the trout will miss him." But despite these encomiums of praise, the memory of Hoover's humanitarian achievements soon began to fade soon after his death. Yes, the state of Iowa, which had turned away from him in the 1932 election, now enacted a day of recognition in his honor, the only one ever so established up to that point. And of course, the diligent efforts by all of you here at the Hoover Library and Museum, Foundation, and by George Nash kept the embers of Hoover's incredible story glowing. But that heat could only radiate so far, and new generations grew up without learning his story. Now, my own encounter with Hoover's legacy came on a Sunday morning in 2001 as I drove along Massachusetts Highway 2 en route from Williamstown to Logan Airport in Boston, when a beckoning open sign in the window of an antique store caused my wife to urge me to stop. So I spun around and drove back, and as she went in and browsed through all the displays, I wandered about the store trying to find something to interest me. And I soon found myself in a room filled with hundreds and hundreds of old National Geographic magazines. And overwhelmed by this daunting aggregation of yellow-colored journals, I was about to turn around and leave when by chance I glanced down the small stack of magazines next to my foot. And on the top of this pile was the September 1917 issue with the barely perceptible headline that said, "The Food Armies of Liberty. The winning weapon, food." An even smaller type was the author's name, Herbert Hoover. To this day, I can't tell you what caused me to look down at that stack, but curious, I bent down and picked it up and soon found myself engrossed in a story with which I was totally unfamiliar. I'd never heard any of this. The article itself was Hoover's call to the American people about how to save food, which could then be shared with people of Europe who were engaged in the titanic struggle of World War I. And having been appointed as U.S. Food Administrator by a Democratic President, Woodrow Wilson, Hoover was in charge of guiding and encouraging Americans to Hooverize their diets so that foodstuffs that could travel well could be shipped to starving populations across the Atlantic that could no longer feed themselves due to the destruction of agricultural production by the war. I bought all the copies of that issue that the antique store had for sale, and soon found myself learning all I could about Hoover's amazing role between 1914 and 23, which had begun with his volunteer position in London, facilitating the travel back to the U.S. of more than 100,000 Americans stranded there by the outbreak of war. And 3 months later, on November 5th, 1914, he organized what would become, for many, the signature historic achievement, the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. And in an unprecedented masterpiece of international negotiation, Hoover obtained agreement from the German military authorities to take food to millions of Belgians trapped by the unexpected occupation of their country. Estimated that more than 9 million people were kept sustained and alive by the food which Hoover delivered to that beleaguered nation. Some would say Hoover saved Belgium. As World War I drew to a close, Hoover, now back in America, was given leadership of the American Relief Administration, distributed food in 20 nations, including the Soviet Union, where in 1921, the worst famine in Europe since the Middle Ages broke out. Millions reportedly died. Hoover called it the greatest famine of all time. And although himself an ardent anti-communist, Hoover shipped food to feed more than 20 million people, including many, many Russian children who were kept alive through a Hoover lunch. And this model became the basis for the creation of UNICEF. Following World War II, working for another Democratic president, Harry Truman, Hoover embarked on a global tour that took him to 38 countries. And he reported to the president that, quote, hunger hangs over the homes of more than 800 million people, adding that the United States faced the alternative of sharing its food or watching its neighbors die. And once again, America shared its bounty with starving people everywhere, thanks to Herbert Hoover's leadership. Perhaps the most compelling words Hoover ever uttered came on a radio broadcast in which, urging American generosity, he said, quote, hunger is a silent visitor who comes like a shadow. He sits beside every anxious mother 3 times a day. He brings not alone suffering and sorrow, but fear and terror. All the values of right living melt before his invasion, and every gain of civilization crumbles. End quote. But I would argue that Hoover's most enduring contribution, one especially relevant today, was in regard to what obligation people, communities, countries have to alleviate the suffering of others far beyond their borders. Hoover wrote that, quote, for thousands of years, the question, am I my brother's people, has echoed in the conscience of mankind. The American people were the first in history to accept that obligation as a nation. Close quote. Those words resonate even more powerfully today, 50 years after his death, as we face the greatest challenge in human history, whether we can sustainably feed the 9 billion people who will be on our planet by the year 2050. I became so enamored of Hoover's legacy that in 2004, my World Food Prize Foundation created a bipartisan Hoover-Wallace dinner to bring Republicans and Democrats together around Iowa's magnificent agricultural and humanitarian heritage. And in the World Food Prize Hall of Laureates in Des Moines, and I hope you'll all come and visit, there's a great mural I commissioned by Iowa artist Gary Kelly, showing Hoover in his rightful place alongside the other great Iowa hunger fighters like Norman Borlaug, George Washington Carver, Henry A. Wallace, and Jesse Field Shambaugh. Together they comprise Iowa's pantheon of heroes, whose remarkable achievements have literally uplifted more than 1 billion people. In his book, American Epic, Hoover notes that under his direction, the United States fed hungry people in countries with populations of more than 1.4 billion people. And on Borlaug's statue in the U.S. Capitol, it is written that, quote, he is the man who saved 1 billion lives. And it's remarkable to consider that Herbert Hoover and Norman Borlaug, the two individuals credited with saving the most human beings from hunger and starvation in all human history, both had their origins in small Iowa towns only about 130 miles apart, making Iowa, in my view, the inspirational epicenter in the global struggle against hunger. Now, as the World Series is being played today, it's interesting to recall that both men also had aspirations to be baseball players. Hoover tried out for shortstop at Stanford, and Borlaug's dream was to play second base for the Chicago Cubs. And I think they might like being remembered as the greatest hunger-fighting double-play combination in history. Now, it's not a given that presidential grave sites and libraries and museums will be built near the birthplace of those chief executives. It's conceivable that Hoover might have chosen a California location near Stanford, or where his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, was buried. But there was something in his Iowa roots, something in those first 10 years of life spent here in West Branch on the west bank of the Wapsinnanock Creek that was deeply planted within him. It stayed with him all his life. It's reflected in his book, in 1931, A Boyhood in Iowa, where he recalled sledding down Cook's Hill, swimming under the willows by the Burlington Railroad Bridge, and the delicious cooking of his Aunt Millie. And it could be seen in the final passages of his speech that he gave here in 1962, the dedication of his library, when he said, quote, "As a boy of 10, I was taken from this village to the far west 78 years ago. My only material assets were 2 dimes in my pocket and the suit of clothes that I wore. But I carried from here something more precious. I had a certificate of the 4th or 5th grade of higher learning. I had stern grounding in religious faith, and I carried with me recollections of a joyous childhood, of the winter snows and the growing crops of Iowa. And I carried with me the family discipline of hard work." It's so fitting that Herbert Hoover is back home, near that parcel of land that his grandfather Eli Hoover first settled, where the West Branch of the Red Cedar Quaker meeting was established. For it's here in Iowa that Herbert Hoover, a man of common origins, will always be one of this state's greatest heroes. And ironically, it's here, so far from all of those places where Hoover spent his life, to which he delivered so much sustenance to hungry people, that his uncommon achievements can be seen more clearly. As the, quote, greatest humanitarian in the history of the United States of America, 50 years from now, or even at the beginning of the 22nd century, Herbert Hoover will still be a beacon of humanitarianism, beckoning future generations of Americans to follow his example and to continue his proud legacy of alleviating hunger wherever it exists in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Quinn. For those of you, Ambassador Quinn has just done a terrific job with the World Food Prize Foundation. If you ever get a chance to go up to Des Moines and see the building, I strongly encourage it. We saw the painting there, and it's just beautiful. And there's nothing better than to get involved with the World Food Prize and with Herbert Hoover, and there's so many connections there. So we look forward to working with Ambassador Quinn in the future.